I want to actually introduce our first keynote speaker. Dr. Jay Marks is a PhD and is widely respected educator who has been in education since 1991, serving as a classroom instructor for 17 years in the Detroit and Southfield public school systems, and now is with the Oakland County. He supports the professional development of all 28 school districts. That's a pretty heavy load, Dr. Marks. He is highly sought after for his work in areas of equity focused on anti-racism, social justice, conversations about race, educating African-American males, student engagement. There's a lot. So, Dr. Marks, I want to say thank you to you for all the time that you have given to our kids in Detroit, especially all the mentoring that you have done. So please welcome to our community conversation. The conversation floor is yours. Please take it over.
Thank you for the wonderful and thoughtful words, Kevin, in your introduction. I am grateful and I am humbled. It's good to be in community with everyone this morning. I am going to share my screen now so that I can pull up my presentation, and then I'll be ready to start. All righty. And let's see here. And in a moment, I'm going to ask someone to let me know, can you see my screen? Then I'll start.
Yes, we can, sir.
All right, great, wonderful. Well, again, good morning. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here with you in community for this community conversation on bullying. I want to thank Jamie Green Canaris. And Jamie, I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. Defeat the Label, Mimic, and the Planning Committee for inviting me to serve as a keynote speaker for this very special event this morning. I am truly honored and I'm humbled. Again, my name is Jay Marks. I'm a diversity and equity consultant. My primary role in Oakland County is to work with educators, students, families, and communities in Oakland County on issues of race, ethnicity, culture, diversity, equity, and social justice. The best part about me is that I am the proud father of these two beautiful teenage young ladies, the loves of my life, I call them, my daughters Amari and Jalea. Amari is 17 years old. She's to your left. She's a high school senior. Jalea is 14 years old. She's to your right. She's a high school freshman. And they're both scholar athletes. They run track and field as well as cross country. They're doing very well academically as well as athletically. And I'll just close by saying I don't go anywhere to talk to anybody about anything without introducing my girls, because I just feel so richly blessed of all the people in the world. God could have chosen to be their father. He chose me. And it's extremely humbling to be their dad. With that, and before I start my conversation, I do want to spend time this morning acknowledging the colonized territory that I'm currently occupying here in my home in Commerce Township, Michigan, which is the original land of the Peoria tribe of Indians of Oklahoma. And it's important, colleagues, that we recognize and acknowledge, right? Recognize and acknowledge the original people of the territory that we inhabit now out of respect and honor for the indigenous people of this land. But it is also a way by doing that to decenter whiteness from the story of how we tell our history in this country. And it's also an important aspect of anti-racism work, which is what we're going to talk about today. So we can't move forward without really humbly, acknowledging the land that we're residing on currently. And this land that I'm sitting on originally belonged to the Peoria tribe of Indians of Oklahoma. I also want to take a moment to recognize National Hispanic Heritage Month, which today is the last day of the month, but in hopes that we take a moment to honor, acknowledge, recognize, and celebrate the valuable contributions that our Hispanic Latinx community have made to our American society, right? And I know today is the last day of the honoring and the celebration, but it should not be the last day that we're raising our awareness, talking, discussing, and being exclusive and celebrating the contributions that our Hispanic and Latinx Americans have made to our American history and our American society. So I wanted to pay homage to our Hispanic and Latinx brothers and sisters and recognize and celebrate them this day. So in starting my talk, I want to set a context for the conversation that I'll have for the remainder of my time with something I put together some years ago. It's called What If? And I started thinking about what if things were different? What if certain things weren't in place? What if certain things weren't happening to us, with us? What if? And so what I'm going to ask you to do, colleagues, as you listen to me, and I will ask that you listen intentionally, I'm going to ask you to ask yourself that, what if? And see what connections you can make to some of the things that I explore as I share this with you, okay? It's called What If? What if? What if students didn't segregate themselves by race and ethnicity in the cafeteria, hallways, parking lots, and other open spaces in our schools? What if? What if students weren't bullied by their peers because of their differences, regardless of whether those differences are real or perceived? What if? What if we had the courage to stand up and speak out against bullies instead of being a bystander to someone else's pain and oppression? What if? What if our Asian students were not stereotyped as the model minority, in that we expect them all to perform with excellence in our math and science classes, but if they had nothing to contribute to the arts, social sciences, and language arts? What if? What if our poor students had as much access and opportunity as their non-economically disadvantaged peers? What if? What if our students who identify themselves as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and or questioning could live in a society that was welcoming, accepting, and inclusive of difference, instead of one that marginalizes, condemns, and isolates them? What if our racially and ethnically diverse students could feel free to express their cultural values instead of having to assimilate to the values of the dominant culture? I ask you, are we a melting pot, or are we a salad bowl, or quite possibly a beautiful mosaic, right, of cultures blending together? What if African-American males could freely walk the streets in their communities, and any community for that matter, without the threat and fear of being gunned down, in many instances, by the very people who are supposed to serve and protect them? Rest in peace, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Jordan Davis, and so many others, senselessly and unjustly killed. What if women and girls in our society benefited from equity, which provided them with as much access and opportunity as afforded to men and boys, particularly as it relates to educational tracking, employment, and income? What if those of us who benefit from privilege based on our race, gender, socioeconomic status, education, and other social factors used our privilege to eliminate practices eradicating privilege in pursuit of equity? What if we had the courage as a society to engage in meaningful conversations about our differences, such as race and religion, instead of ignoring them or avoiding them as if they don't matter? What if social justice, cultural competence, culturally responsive teaching, and anti-racism was just as important as the Common Core and standardized tests as it relates to professional learning for educators and the schooling experiences of our children? What if we recognize that the power of being a diverse community and society is that there is strength in our differences, right? There's strength in our differences as well as our similarities. It is the strength in our differences, I find, that allow us to grow. What if we all realize that we are the dream that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was referring to, and that we need to wake up and begin living out his dream? What if we recognize that, in the words of Dr. King, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere? I ask you, colleagues, what if all these were true? What if? What if? What if? Hopefully you were able to make a connection based off of one of those statements to your personal lives and or your professional practice. This quote by one of my heroes, James Baldwin, who was a bad, bad brother during his time. Bad, bad brother. If you know anything about he and his work and his voice and his activism. This quote has been resonating with me for quite some time, the last couple of years in my work. And he says that if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things that you don't see. And that may sound familiar to some of you, particularly your parents, having to make our children, our own children, conscious of things that they don't see as we're raising them. So I want to preface my talk this morning by informing you that what I'm going to say to you today is going to be purely out of love. Purely out of love for you, your students, your families, and our collective humanity. Our collective humanity, which we share on this planet. Because I believe if we truly love all of our students, particularly our Black, Brown, and Indigenous students, who are often at the margins of our systems in this society, we will work to dismantle the systems that perpetuate their oppression, particularly again in the instance of schools and school systems. So this presentation is not about blame, shame, or guilt, although those are normal emotions that come with the work because it is emotional work, but that is not what this talk is about. It is about acknowledging, it's about accountability. One of the things I would like to acknowledge is our history in this country, because I don't know how we have an honest conversation about equity and anti-racism without acknowledging the history of this country and the formation and foundation of this country. So what we're seeing playing out in the media and the streets across American cities, urban, suburban, rural, is not new. Violence and terror against people of color in the United States is a part of our history, our systems and structures, and the social fabric of our society, with an absence of systemic accountability along the way. And that's something that we need to acknowledge together. See, I believe that our system that we have here, it was built to be inequitable. It was built and framed around the ideologies of racism and white supremacy. And again, I don't know how we move forward as a community, as a society, without acknowledging the truth behind the creation of this nation, which has manifested itself, in my belief, and what we're seeing today play out in our society, not just in the criminal justice system, but in all systems, our school systems, healthcare systems, governmental systems. And family, I want to be clear. This is our inheritance. We did not create this. Your parents did not create this. Your grandparents did not create this. Now, if we're not careful, we could be perpetuating it and helping to sustain it and even promoting it. But we did not create this. We inherited it. However, I believe we have an obligation to do something to eradicate this inheritance. See, our schools were not designed they were not designed for people of color. They were not designed for girls in many instances. They were not designed for the poor. They were not designed for those who are ability different. They were not designed for members of the LGBTQ plus community. They were not designed for people who are not Christians. They were not designed for people who speak English as a second, third, fourth, or fifth language. They were designed for a certain group of people. Here yet in the year 2020, we're trying to create equity in spaces that were designed to be inequitable. So I don't believe our society and or our schools are broken at all. I believe they are functioning perfectly based on their original design. They are doing exactly what they were designed to do, and that is to be inequitable and unjust. Again, in my facilitation and presentation, we have to get to truth telling. And a part of that is acknowledging what has happened in this country and what is happening in this country. The rate at which Black Americans are killed by police are more than twice as high as the rate of white Americans in this country. And what you see in front of you is not a non-comprehensive list of deaths at the hands of police in the US, but it is a list of bodies, Black and brown bodies that have been slain since Eric Garner's death in 2014. Again, this is not a comprehensive list. And at the bottom, you see the names of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. And there have been others since. So again, it's around acknowledging where we are, what's in front of us, what obligations do we see that we have, and are we being complicit in the deaths of these beautiful lives that we've lost. See, we talk about Black Lives Matter, and I know that there's some suggestions that all lives matter. I think we all can agree to that. But I also believe all lives can't matter if Black lives don't matter too. And what I just presented to you was just an illustration of that. So the rest of the time, I have a few more minutes left. We'll talk about these things. I want to define some terms for you because I think that's important, that we have some common language, or at least you know the framework by which I'm coming from with the language I use. Then we're going to talk about some competencies, which are knowledge, skills, and level of understanding that educators need to be anti-racist and equitable in their practices. Then we're going to talk about actions we can take. And then lastly, I'll offer some closing remarks. I'll put some resources that I have for you also in the chat. I'll put them in after my talk. And all of the resources I'll be sharing with you accompany my talk. And it's the how-tos to what I'm saying. It's not enough for me to just talk at you. We have to have some things, some tools, if you will, to be able to put these things, operationalize, institutionalize, and put these ideas and concepts into practice. So here's another question for you. Because again, I mentioned this conversation is about love this morning. So I want to know from you, what does love look like in your equity work? You're an equity leader, what does love look like in that work of yours? What does love also look like in your anti-racism work? What does it look like? How does it show up? I'll come back to this question later on in my talk. But to think about, what does love look like in your practice? So let's look at a couple of terms. A few terms rather, equity, anti-racism, and anti-racist. There's a group of colleagues, equity leaders that I've been working with over the last several months. We identify ourselves as the Southeast Michigan Equity Coalition. And we define equity this way. We needed a comprehensive definition to really capture intentionally what this word and what this work means to us. So we have defined equity this way. It refers to an educational asset, right, that students need in order to be successful in school and beyond. Equity is achieved through intentional shifts in policy and practice away from just attaining equality and towards providing for the individualized needs of everyone. This shift must occur in the areas of curriculum, assessment, pedagogy, and belief systems, and intentionally engage students, families, community members, and educators in recognizing, responding, and redressing biases, inequities, and oppressive ideologies. Equity requires dismantling systemic racism through continuous examination of policies and practices. Equity pedagogy requires educators to hold a critical consciousness to cultivate classroom environments and implement teacher practices that affirms students' humanity, sustains their joy, and cultivates their brilliance, especially those who have been harmed in school and society. What I'm going to ask you to do is go to the chat, and I'm not going to acknowledge them, but Kevin is monitoring the chat for us. And again, thank you, Kevin. I want you to find a word in there that's resonating with you. And I want you to put that word in the chat. If you're in the audience with us this morning, put that word in the chat. One word from this definition that's resonating with you.
We may have that disabled, but if they do start putting them in, I'm going to tell you what people are saying. If you can't see them, Doctor,
Okay.
it's oppressive is the first one that just came in. Biases. Systematic racism.
I'll take two more if you have them, Kevin.
We're waiting for them to come in.
Okay.
Individualized and harm. So please continue, but if some more come in and you ask
Thank
me,
you,
I
sir.
will give them to you.
Thank you. Gave me the time for a coffee break. And
No problem.
one of the words I wanted to draw attention to was one of the words that was shared, harmed. And that's what I want us to think about. That's what's happening to our children. When we don't do this intentionally, when we don't get it right, when we don't put everything we have into this, that is what's happening every day in our schools, is that many of our children are being harmed. So when we talk about equity, sometimes, and many of you have seen this diagram before, others similar to it. And this is just a good visual illustration for us to really begin to break down the difference between equity and equality, right? The equality being the assumption that everyone benefits from the same supports, right? Equal treatment. And sometimes we call that being fair, but I don't really think that's being fair at all, because as we see, treating everyone the same can be oppressive. It can marginalize, discriminate, and put people on the margins of our society when we do the same for everybody, or give everyone the same, or treat everyone the same, because everyone doesn't need the same. So as a result, we move towards equity and being more equitable in our practices, right? Giving people the support that they need, right? An example of this is affirmative action, right? And we've seen how that was, at least in its inception, designed to produce equity, but it has not fully done that, right? It's done that for some people, right? The greatest benefactor of affirmative action policies in this country have been white women historically. So there's been some benefactors, but it has not met its full intention, I believe. But then next we have what's called justice, right? And then as you can see, all three of the people in the image can see without accommodations, right? The inequity has been addressed, the barriers have been removed. And that's what we are seeking. We're seeking to address inequities by removing systemic barriers. However, there's another image I want to call your attention to, where we see equality very similarly as the last image, and we see equity very similarly as the last image. But I want you to look at that last picture, liberation, and think about justice versus liberation, and how freeing liberation is. And that's what we want. The ultimate goal is to provide liberation and liberatory education for all of our students, particularly our Black, Brown, and Indigenous students, and students who've been at the margin of their own schooling experience historically, those who were not thought of when American education system was founded. So do we love our students? The question is, do we love our students enough to provide them with a liberatory education, one that is free from the oppression of this society? Now let's look at anti-racism. And this comes from an organization called Race Forward, who defines anti-racism this way. Anti-racism is defined as the work of actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life. Anti-racism tends to be an individualized approach and set up in opposition to individual racist behaviors and impacts. That's anti-racism. However, anti-racist, which is another term that we've been using a lot lately, it's a huge part of the lexicon of what's being talked about in our society, but specifically in this context, education. That an anti-racist, and this comes from our brother, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, the author of the book Stamp, as well as How to Be an Anti-Racist, one of the most popular books of the summer. He defines anti-racist this way: as someone who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing anti-racist ideas. This includes the expression or ideas that racial groups are equals and none needs developing and is supporting policy that reduces racial inequity. I want to draw your attention to a phrase in there, a couple of words. This includes the expression or ideas that racial groups are equals and none needs developing, which suggests that there's no inferior racial group. And we know that race is a social construct. It's man-made. There's no biological, scientific connection, right? No DNA. None of us have a race gene, right? If you will. We know that it was made by man to benefit man and to justify behaviors of man, like the genocide of our indigenous brothers and sisters and the taking of their land and the enslavement of Africans. So we know that. But the socialization of race, how we interact with each other based on the skin color, is very real, right? But no racial groups needs developing because we stand on equal ground and equal footing. So Kendi goes on to say that the opposite of racist is not racist, it's anti-racist. And again, there are a lot of people, which is wonderful to me, have been identifying as anti-racist these days. I think that's great, I really do. But as Allison Park, a racial justice leader on the West Coast in the Bay Area advises, how do we jump from being a racist to an anti-racist? Where's being a racist at in this equation without even acknowledging the fact that racism may possibly have existed inside of us? So we go from, no, I'm not a racist, to no, I'm an anti-racist, without even acknowledging, quite possibly, that there's racism that exists on the inside of us. And this is an acknowledgement, I think, that is important for us to authentically move forward as anti-racist. Not necessarily an acknowledgement to others, but acknowledgement and self-reflection to yourselves. According to Dr. Robin DiAngelo, white anti-racist scholar, as well as the author of the book, White Fragility, which many of you, another popular bestseller over the summer that many of you have read or are reading, she says, the question that we should be asking ourselves now is not, am I a racist? Because that's a very passive stance to say, I'm not a racist, right? I could just say I'm not a racist, put racism on someone else and move on with my day. She says, that's not the question. The question, rather, she suggests, is how have, not am I racist, but how have I been impacted by the forces of racism? Meaning, again, an acknowledgement of the racism that may be inside of me, simply because of how this society was created. And it's around all of us. And if we've all been socialized in this very same society, how could it have missed us? Right? Just like jumping in a pool, a pond, a lake, a river, or an ocean, and thinking you're not going to get wet, or being surprised that you got wet, right? Just something to think about. So let's look at some competencies, some essential elements of cultural proficiency, which is a large part of my work. And I use this framework to facilitate professional learning with groups that I work with. So the first one is identifying, assessing culture, which means to identify the differences that exist between you and the people that are in your environment. So if you're a classroom teacher, you're looking at yourself, your own identities, your own culture, and then the identities and culture of the students in your classroom. If you're a building level administrator, you're looking at yourself, your family, then the students and families and staff in your building. Excuse me. If you are a district level administrator, superintendent, central office staff member, you're looking at your identities, your family's identities, and the identities and cultures of the families that live within the entire school community, right? But the work does not start with them, family. It starts with you. That's why we call it inside out work. So it's not about who are these other people who are different from me and what can I do to fix them, so to make them assimilate to dominant cultures. No, it's more about who am I? What are my beliefs? What are my values? What biases and stereotypes and prejudices do I hold about people based on my own experiences and socialization? What privileges might I have based on my own identity? For example, like me as a male, I have a privilege there. I'm also a Christian, I have a privilege there, right? I'm also heterosexual, I have a privilege there. I don't have to worry about losing my job because of someone, or losing my status because of someone finding out my family dynamic, or who I love, or whom I'm married to. Same thing with being a Christian. having the ability and the advantage, the unearned advantage of having holidays off and not having to get my children excused from school because they're off too. The advantage of being able to travel anywhere in this country and many places around the world and get to a hotel, open up the drawer of the nightstand and find my book. Not the Holy Quran, not the Torah, but my book. My book, right? And that's wonderful if you're a Christian. But how marginalizing and oppressive is it if you're Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, right? Then to think about what identities might you have where you have been marginalized. Like I know I also am privileged because of, on paper, my socioeconomic status says that I'm middle class, and I emphasize on paper because I have teenage girls. I have no money family, none. But on paper, it would suggest I'm middle class. But I'm a Black man in America. So the racism that I experience on a regular basis, regardless of my middle class status, my level of education, holding a doctorate, right? My vocation of being an educator, my age of 53, my religion of being a Christian, the vile hatred of racism impacts me on a daily basis because of my experiences. So we have to assess culture, but then we need to look at value and diversity. How do we show that we value diversity? How do we show that we value diversity of the students in our classroom? How do we let our students know that we embrace their differences as assets and not impediments or deficits? What conscious decisions are we making to be inclusive, to let our students know, I see you, I hear you? What parts of our practice, when students walk into our classroom, do they see themselves valued in the way that the classroom is set up? Do they see themselves valued in the curriculum materials and resources that we use, the textbooks, the stories, the examples? Next is managing the dynamics of difference, which acknowledges that issues sometimes and conflict is a natural process when different people come together. Why? We're different. We don't understand each other. But diversity isn't a problem. We understand that. We understand that because we're differences, there may be some conflict caused by our differences. So we learn how to manage them so that we all feel welcome and included. Kind of like we do in our households when there's conflict in our household. We know how to do this. When there's conflict in your household, how do you get along? You extend grace, you forgive, you seek to understand, you listen, we compromise, we collaborate, right? We empathize. Why? Because the love is stronger than the conflict. Can our love for each other as human beings be stronger than any conflict that be caused by our differences? That's what I ask of us. Then is adapting to diversity. What changes are you willing to make in your practice to be inclusive and equitable? To make sure to show our students that we're learning about them by infusing elements of their culture and their experiences and their backgrounds into our practice. This is where culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally responsive teaching comes to play. We begin to select textbooks, stories, classroom decor, routines that align itself with the culture of our students. And lastly, there's institutionalizing cultural knowledge. And that's where we look at policies and practices to make the difference. We normalize it now, and it becomes a part of the way that we do business in our school system, in our classroom, in our district, okay? It's a new way of thinking, right? Making learning about cultural groups a part of what we do, like professional learning, training, okay? It's an integral part of the process. And then lastly, what actions can we take to be an anti-racist? This comes from the research of Dr. Dina Simmons, right? Who's going to offer some things that we can do. But I encourage us to consider this quote by Audre Lorde. When we think about what tools we need to use to take action, she says, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Some would suggest that we have not made progress in this country because we keep using the tools that were created to oppress us, which is interesting. if we acknowledge and know that this country was not founded to be equitable in the first place, and it was framed and founded around the ideologies of racism and white supremacy, why are we using those tools to eradicate racism and white supremacy? Just another question. So we need to stop racism. Here's a couple of actions that we could take. One, engage in vigilant self-awareness, constantly reflecting, thinking, and exploring our own identities and the role that we play in systems of oppression. And thinking about how our own identities show up in our lessons, and are we designing lessons that are framed in whiteness, right? And if we are, how is that marginalizing and providing an oppressive schooling experience for our students of color? She says we need to acknowledge racism and the ideology of white supremacy, and going back and thinking about how that shows up and plays in our larger society, right? And acknowledge that racism and racist ideologies exist, and to reflect even on to what degree have we been complicit in racism and white supremacy? Meaning, we know it exists, we've done nothing to eradicate it on an individual, personal level. She says we need to study and teach representative history. We need to do that accurately, so students see themselves as an integral part of the fabric of our American story, right? So we don't have to have Heritage Month anymore, because we are recognizing our Hispanic, Latinx, African-American women. We have Pride Month in June, members of the LGBTQ+ community. We're recognizing our indigenous people on a regular basis, being truly inclusive. She says we need to talk about race with our students. And I know that's a difficult, challenging thing to do. I offer a session at Oakland Schools, one on courageous conversations about race, and then we have an Anti-Racist Leadership Institute, where we invite educators from the region to come and learn about these concepts and how to have these conversations, but also how to show up as anti-racist leaders, right? And then lastly, she says, when you see racism, do something. Begin to think about on a professional level. Consider how the academic resources, policies, admission practices and policies, hiring practices and policies, grading policies and practices, behavior management policies and practices at your school, how might they be racist? Whom do these practices and policies benefit? Who might be marginalized by them? And again, this comes from the work of Dr. Dina Simmons. So I'm going to show you a quick video. It's 5 tips of being an ally. Many of you have seen this before. So check it out. It's only 3 minutes long. Hopefully we can check it out. All righty.
Hey friends, so I'm trying something different with my setup and I don't know if it's working, but you will deal. Imagine your friend is building a house and they ask you to help, but you've never built a house before. So it'd probably be a good idea for you to put on some protective gear and listen to the person in charge. Otherwise, someone's gonna get seriously hurt. Look, I'm helping! It's the exact same idea when it comes to being an ally. An ally is a person that wants to fight for the equality of a marginalized group that they're not a part of. We need your help building this house, but you probably should listen so you know what to do first. Let's do this. So here are my 5 tips for being a good ally. Understand your privilege. Now, a lot of people get hung up on the word privilege, so let me break it down for you nice and easy. Privilege does not mean that you are rich, that you've had an easy life, that everything's been handed to you and you've never had to struggle or work hard. All it means is that there are some things in life that you will not experience or ever have to think about just because of who you are. It's kind of like those horses that have those blinders on. They can see just fine. There's just a whole bunch of stuff on the side that they don't even know exists. So for example, there are currently 29 states where you can legally be fired for being gay, and there are 34 states where you can legally be fired for being trans. Now, as a straight cis woman, those are things that I don't have to ever think about if I don't want to. I'm not going to be fired because I'm straight and I'm not going to be fired because I'm cis. So it makes sense that before I can fight for the rights of others, I have to understand what rights I have and others don't. That's privilege. Listen and do your homework. It sounds like a no-brainer, but it's not possible for you to learn if you aren't willing to listen. So you got to know when to zippa the lippa. I don't know. You get what I mean. But that's the thing that's so cool about social media. There are so many people sharing their stories all around the world and connecting with people that they normally would never get a chance to without the power of the internet. So do your homework. Start reading blogs, tweets, news articles, and stories so that you can get caught up on the issues that are important to the communities that you want to support. Speak up, but not over. If the Fight for Equality was a girl group, the ally wouldn't be the lead singer or the second lead singer. They'd be Michelle. An ally's job is to support. You want to make sure that you use your privilege and your voice to educate others, but make sure to do it in such a way that does not speak over the community members that you're trying to support or take credit for things that they are already saying. This isn't Mario Kart. Stay in your lane. Realize that you're going to make mistakes and apologize when you do. Nobody's perfect. Unlearning problematic things takes time and work, so you are bound to mess up and trip and fall. But don't worry, you can brush yourself off and get right back up. I'm back up! Just remember that it's not about your intent, it's about your impact. So when you get called out, make sure to listen, apologize, commit to changing your behavior, and move forward. Last but certainly not least, actually the most important thing on this list is remember that ally is a verb. Saying you're an ally is not enough. You gotta do the work. 1 through 4. 1 through 4. As always, there are links in the video description box to some of the things I mentioned in this video, along with some resources that have been really helpful for me as I've gone along in my journey to be more conscious. So I want to hear from you in the comments. What are some sites that you suggest checking out, and what are some things that have helped you become a better ally? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe. See you when I see you. Bye!
So,
hey friends, so I'm trying something different with my...
You're able to identify at least one of those approaches as being an ally that you would consider incorporating into your practice as an ally. We lost. This has been a trying year for all of us. Maybe the most trying year of some of our lifetime thus far. I'm 53 years old myself. But we lost one of our heroes, Congressman, Representative John Lewis. And what a living testimony to equity and anti-racism. And he left us with a lot of wisdom. And one of the things he left us with is this saying, never ever be afraid to make noise and to get in trouble. Good, necessary trouble. And being an equity leader, an anti-racist leader, an advocate, activist, accomplice, co-conspirator against injustice and oppression requires for all of us to make some noise, to get in good trouble, necessary trouble. So as I close, I want to remind you that this is not about a moment. And I know we've had a moment for this time that I've been speaking with you, but it's not about a moment. It's really about movements. And that's what we need. We need action. So I asked you earlier, what will love look like in your equity work? I will ask you again, what will it look like in your equity work? What will love look like in your anti-racism work? You have a bunch of resources. I'll put all of these in the chat at the, once I wrap up with you. You have them, you can click right on the links. It's enough to sustain you for quite some time, okay? So just spend some time and commit to engaging with these resources that I'm sharing. Dr. King says, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And there's a lot of darkness these days. I think that's evident. He also says that hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And I believe that love is the answer. And that's why I designed my talk with you this morning around love. So I'm going to show this last video that can be emotional, but it talks about the power of love. And it's called Love Has No Labels.
I tried, even if I wanted to. My love, my love, my love, she keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. And I can't change, even if I tried, even if I wanted to. My love, my love, my love, she keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. And I can't change, even if I tried, even if I wanted to. My love, my love, my love, she keeps me warm. 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 She keeps me warm.
My heart doesn't see race. Love has no age limit.
That's my best friend.
We are neighbors and best friends.
We all have different religions, but we have universal love as well.
I love my sister.
Love is love.
Our family is no less than any other family.
I'm not crying on Sundays, 'cause I'm not crying on Sundays.
Now, I don't know about you, but if that is not a perfect example of the power of love, family, I don't know what is. So I know we have questions, but I want to end with a final thought. This conversation, this work around equity and anti-racism reminds me of a conversation that a father may, or a parent, but in this instance, a father may have with his son, where the father says to his son, "Son, be careful where you walk." The son replies, "Dad, you're the one who needs to be careful. Remember, I'm following in your footsteps." Colleagues, our children and our students, they see everything and they hear everything, and they're following in our footsteps. The question is, what footprints are we leaving for them? Thank you. Kevin, I'll take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Marks. It was wonderful. It was thought provoking. I love the what if. That is the same thing I use with students when I talk with them about how they can be that change. But you're absolutely right. We are that change as well, and we must be there. We do have some questions, and people have been asking in the chat. You put in your resources, and there's other information we can get from you. If we don't get through all these couple of questions, we'll make sure that we get them answered and get them back out to everybody. So Rebecca was in Kansas, and I think you really kind of touched on this a little bit. What can we do as teachers to support and practice anti-racism in our classroom when Black students are a minority? You may have hit a little bit about that in your competencies, but is there something you can point Rebecca to?
Well, there are a bunch of resources. So one of the things that we have to do, Rebecca, is all of us have to commit to doing our own work. So I'm glad you asked that question, because part of doing our own work is doing, as the video suggested, we have to do our own learning in terms of reading about how can I be an ally and advocate for historically marginalized and minoritized groups, so I can be a voice and in alignment with them and their oppression. Right, but we have to do our work, which means you have to do some internal work, thinking about who you are, your own identity, your own experiences, your own beliefs, how you see your students, right? So you have to begin to think about your own mindset. How have you been informed and socialized around race and racism and equity in this country? What privileges might you have? How have you been marginalized? As you're doing that, learning more about the groups that you're trying to serve, right? So we're not putting all that learning on their backs. Sometimes we expect members of historically minoritized or marginalized groups to teach us how to be allies against their oppression. That's not what's up. That's not what's up. What's up is that we do our own work. And then we align, we show up letting them know we're doing our own work. My daughters, I am thankful that God gave me two beautiful girls because they pointed out some things in me that I would have never saw, right? For example, certain ways that they believe that I operate that are sexist. And they would say, Dad, that's sexist. And I would first get defensive like we do, right? I'm a diversity and equity consultant. I'm not sexist. And they'll say, well, Dad, when you say this or do this, would you say or do that if we were boys? And I'm like, good question. Let me get back to you, right? I was able to, because I loved them so much, be open enough to receive feedback for them. So now, not only can I work on my own self, my own isms, right, that are blind spots, like the video showed, I can show up as a feminist for them, with them, right? So do your own work, do some reading, partner with your students in terms, because they're not going to always be there. So they're not going to be there when you're writing lesson plans. They're not going to be there when teachers are making decisions about placement, who should go in special ed, who should have opportunity for advanced placement and honors, college prep, and the like, right? So we have to be the voice of the voiceless, but we have to do our own work first.
So on that, I'm going to ask you one last question. We're running out of time, but this is also very important in the time that we're in. I'm going to dovetail two questions from Marie and was it Chris? So in the classroom, how do we promote anti-racism in the classroom? And probably as not taking over the conversation is one part of that. But also, how can we continue this conversation when at times we're being shut down by administration, possibly because of complaints about Black Lives Matter? So there's one, we don't want to overtake the whole conversation, but how do we have that conversation? And how do we kind of approach those things from administration at times?
Sometimes with, well, we want to talk about what's important to students. So sometimes you don't have to bring it up at all. Put students in a circle. If you're into restorative practices, restorative justice, if you start your class off that way and ask them what's going on and give each student an opportunity to share. You know, you have to create a safe, inclusive, and brave environment to do that, right? So you can't just get into having these conversations. You got to build relationships with your students first as human beings. That's what I suggest. Get to know your students as human beings first, and then develop a level of trust. As you're developing that trust, then you could be into sprinkling questions like, what's going on in your life? What's going on in society? How you feel about things that are going on in society? Now you're just putting a question out there and they're leading the conversation now. You're just facilitating and providing a context for the conversation, right? As it relates to Black Lives Matter, it's a movement and it's not new. We've had other movements in this country as a result of systemic oppression. We've had the women's suffrage movement, civil rights movement, gay rights movement. Now we have the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a movement, and we should not have to have a movement. Meaning, people should not have to stand up and say Black Lives Matter because of the discrepancy, disproportionate nature of the murder of Black and brown lives. But as a result of that, Black people have stood up, like women have stood up, members of the LGBTQ+ community have stood up, and other activists have stood up during other movements to say enough is enough, right? And so I tell people, if you don't like, I know Kevin, it's time, but if you don't like Black Lives Matter movement, that's fine, you have a right to that. What movement do you offer that eradicate racial injustice, that eradicate white supremacy and racism from our institutions? What movement do you have? So then we can work.
And I think, as you said, it opens the conversation, which is what we need to have. And sometimes that conversation is extremely difficult to have, but without the hard work, we're not moving forward.
Yeah. And we got to have the conversation, like you said, Kevin, or else we would continue to be stagnant. And our children will continue to be disappointed in us for not having the courage to have the conversation, because that they're willing to have.
Yeah. Powerful words, a great presentation. We have more questions, but we're going to get those questions to you. We will have those answered and get those back out. I know Kristen and some others that were looking for those answers. We will get them to you because we know that this is, I have my own questions that I'm not asking.
Right.
But it was wonderful. It was powerful. And thank you. We're going to go into a quick 5-minute break, let people kind of get a stretch, and we'll be welcoming our next speaker. But so we're going to go to just a quick little break. So everybody come right back. And again, we thank you for being with us. We're getting these questions from Chicago, from Kansas, from Canada. So it is important that this word goes out and everyone keeps this conversation alive far beyond 1 o'clock when we end today. And it's something that you can always refer back to. Look at Dr. Mark's PowerPoint, the other things that'll be coming up later today. Keep the conversation alive, and that's how we make a change. Maybe not for ourselves. We're going to make it for somebody else. And that's why we become strong advocates, is for those other people. Dr. Mark,
I want to say thank you. I want to say Asante Sana, which is thank you very much, Healy. Asante Sana.